episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Patrick Bangert, who is Vice President of Artificial Intelligence and heads the Artificial Intelligence Engineering and Sciences teams at Samsung SDS, which is a subsidiary of the Samsung Group, which provides information technology services, and they're active in research and development of emerging IT technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, Internet of Things, and engineering outsourcing. Dr. Bangert is responsible for both the Brightics AI Accelerator, which is a distributed machine learning training and automated machine learning product, and for X.insights, which is a data center intelligence platform. Among his other responsibilities is to act as a visionary at Samsung for the future of artificial intelligence. Before joining Samsung, Dr. Bangert spent 15 years as the Chief Executive Officer of Algorithmica Technologies, a machine learning software company serving the chemicals and oil and gas industries. Prior to that, he was assistant professor of applied mathematics at Jacobs University in Germany, as well as a researcher at Los Alamos National Laboratory and at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Dr. Bangert obtained his machine learning PhD in mathematics and his master's in theoretical physics from the University College in London. Native of Germany, Patrick grew up in Malaysia and the Philippines and later lived in the UK, Austria, Nepal, and the US. So he has done business and worked in many countries around the world, believes that AI ultimately needs to serve humanity beyond just the automation of routine tasks. In addition to everything else he's doing, he is an accomplished author, having written 2 books, including Machine Learning and Data Science in the Oil and Gas Industry, Best Practices, Tools, and Case Studies, and Optimization for Industrial Problems. In addition to all that, he also has a master's in Tibetan Psychology and Philosophy from the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. Dr. Patrick Bangert, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for the very long and kind introduction.
Absolutely, and I love to start off like we typically do by handing you the floor just for a little bit to talk about yourselves. If you could sort of take us back a little bit to everything from where you grew up, how you developed your interest in mathematics, in physics, and ultimately, tell us a little bit about your early career journey, because you were involved in some really major areas: nuclear physics, solar, magnetohydrodynamics, really major topics. Talk a little bit about earlier in your career, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So, when I was growing up, my dad always had these astronomy books lying around. And so from a very early age, I was exposed to astrophysics, at least on a picture level, right? And the pictures of galaxies and stars and nebulas and so on, they look fascinating. And so you think, what is it? How does this work? And that's how I really got interested in how the world works. So ultimately, that's why I signed up for a physics degree. Then at university, after spending a few years in the laboratory, I figured out that the experiments, at least the experiments I do, fail. And so I got quite frustrated with that aspect. So I figured I need to be a theorist. Right? If I can calculate things with a pencil on paper, that's under my control. That's what I can do. The experimentation, not so much. So that's why I really went to the theoretical side of things. But still, the motivation is how to figure out how the world works. Now, in physics, what you do is you have this conversation between doing experiments and then doing theory based on equations that you do. And you involve generally a large number of people over a very long time. So developing good theories might take decades, as we can see in the history of physics. Really, artificial intelligence is kind of a promise to shortcut a lot of this stuff. And that's how I first really got interested in that, is to say, okay, can't we effectively reproduce the equations that we develop over years and years and years within just a few hours on a computer? And of course, the outcome is not the same. Yeah. the equation that humans produce is short and understandable, and is clean, that can be described and derived from somewhere. The equations that artificial intelligence provide, of course, are not at all short and understandable, and something you can look at and do something with, but they work.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, it comes back to that really philosophical discussion: what's physics even for, right?
Right.
It is the result understanding, or is it a mere prediction machine that simply says, if you do this, that will result, and therefore allows you to do things like engineer new goods? Mm-hmm. Right. So I know this is a very ancient debate that's still ongoing. My personal take on it is that physics will never provide true understanding. Understanding has to be supplied outside, and it's physics's job to tell you what will happen if you do something. Mm-hmm. And artificial intelligence really, I think, is a fantastic tool, but no more than that. It is a tool to help you get there faster. And that's how I got involved really in AI. I got involved very early on during my PhD process, and tried to apply it to a few practical problems over my early career. And I figured out that being a university researcher is very tricky. When I was a student at university, people told me, okay, the only real thing that is kind of worthy to be as a career as a research professor, everything else is a little bit second class, right? So I bought into that kind of propaganda program, and I made it all the way to becoming assistant professor at a university, by which time I realized that the context under which they said this to me had changed. Mm-hmm. When you became a research professor in the 1970s, maybe even the 1980s, you really did get the freedom to research what you would like, and you had employment for life, and you had a few students, PhD type students, who would help out in that research effort. That has very much changed. Nowadays, professors are first and foremost grant writing machines, and the people to benefit from the grants who actually do the research are the PhD students and the postdocs. The professors themselves do very little actual research still. And then there is the publish or perish game, by which you have to publish a lot of papers in reputable journals, of course, to justify your research. So it's not as nice as advertised, which is why I ended up starting a company, Algorithmica Technologies, which I then used to take artificial intelligence from the university research department to practice. And more or less through accident, I got involved with the chemicals and petrochemicals industries. At the time, I was living in Germany, and those industries are quite big over there.
Sure.
And so I encountered some of the problems they have, predictive maintenance, for example, optimization of the processes. And that's how I got involved there for quite a few years, doing that using AI. And recently, I joined Samsung SDS, the IT company of Samsung Group. And here we develop AI models for all sorts of use cases, of course, partially for the consumer electronics that the Samsung Group makes, but beyond that, quite far into natural language processing. But the focus is on computer vision. So somebody takes an image of some kind, perhaps a medical image like an MRI scan, and then some sort of interpretation is supposed to happen. Right. So very simply speaking, go find the tumor on the brain scan. That sort of thing is what we do here.
It's been a fascinating journey so far. As listening to your path from starting out to academia to successful startups, working for big companies and industries, and now into Samsung. I think I'd love to start off from where we are now with actually a piece that you wrote a couple months ago. It's called "The Status and Future of AI," where you go into one aspect, sort of the real and the perceived imagination of the public. Yes, my robot vacuum cleaner works fine here. No, it's not going to come alive and kill me type stuff. Fine. And then, but the more important part, you talk about sort of the commercial artificial intelligence systems versus some of the more complex stuff that you think about in the academic field. And you talk about sort of your vision on how there needs to be sort of a redesign, and you point out sort of a very popular sort of a narrow, what you term the connectionist approach of current systems to sort of more older sort of logical approaches, reasoning systems, and so forth. Without going too deep into these topics, could you just take us for a few minutes on sort of your vision and what's going on today, and how some of these current sort of narrow AI systems need to be improved in your perspective?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an excellent question. So if we go back to the 1950s, back then when people talked about artificial intelligence, they really talked about a computer system behaving like a human being. The emphasis was mostly on communication, language. So if I have a conversation with, let's say, an entity, and I don't know whether that entity is in fact a human being or a computer program. And after some time of talking to this entity, asking questions, getting answers back, having a chit chat about this, that, and the other, if I cannot be certain at all whether or not I'm talking to a human or an AI system, then the AI system, if it is such, has passed what's called the Turing Test. Yeah, so this is the Turing Test. Basically, we have a long conversation, and if the conversation is pretty good, then pass. Right. So this was coined by Alan Turing in the 1940s, I believe. And that test is still outstanding. Right? Up until today, we do not have a system that will pass that test. Even the most advanced natural language processing systems, if you ask them simple questions, they'll get you the wrong answer. It will sound reasonable. They get the grammar right, they get basic vocabulary right, but they get the content wrong. So for example, ask a natural language system an arithmetical question. For example, I have 3 apples and 2 pears. How many fruit do I have? You will get the wrong answer, almost certainly. Because they don't have that real world understanding. So that part of artificial intelligence up until today is very much a challenge that we have not answered yet. So a practical exercise for everybody is go to a big website of a big manufacturer of something like cars or so on. You'll find a chatbot pop up in the bottom corner. Mm-hmm. Ask it some questions. You'll see that it will not take you very long at all to get some pretty ridiculous answers. Right. So that's the state of the art for natural language communication, which was originally meant by the word artificial intelligence. Okay. Now, what we actually find today in terms of systems that work, which we happen to also refer to by artificial intelligence, is really what mathematicians have called machine learning, which is supposedly something different. Now, we use the words AI and ML as synonyms. They mean the same thing today, but they didn't used to. So machine learning used to refer to a purely numerical analysis that didn't have to do with human communication, that had to do with calculating numbers. So for instance, if I give you a series of numbers and I ask you to forecast the next one in that series, that's a kind of machine learning task. Now, that's interesting, for example, if those numbers are the weather and I ask you to forecast tomorrow's weather. Mm-hmm. Or if I ask you to forecast how many units will be sold in a store of a certain product, right? So that's one thing that Samsung does, for example. We want to know how many phones we will sell in a certain store in San Francisco next month, the month after that,
Sure.
and over all the stores in the US. And then we'll, of course, ask the question, how many phones do we need to make in order to satisfy that need? How much raw materials will we need even earlier in time to make those phones in the first place, and so on and so forth. So you can see forecasting has a very practical consequence. And the answer is that, or the result is that we can make those forecasts very accurately, and they hold. So with machine learning, this kind of numerical analysis, we can get answers that are accurate enough to really help our practical life. As a private individual, you experience this, for example, in recommender systems. If you dial up Netflix and you've seen a few movies, it will recommend you a new movie to watch, and it's pretty good. Yeah, you're likely to like the movies that it suggests to you. So there's a practical AI model you interact with on a daily basis that works for you, whereas the chatbot doesn't. So here we see that, you know, the ML type approaches work, they're deployed, they influence your life on a daily basis. They're the ones who tell you what to watch on TV, what to buy on Amazon, how much to pay for your airline ticket. All sorts of models influence your daily life. They're all ML based, and the AI based models have really taken a backseat.
Got it.
Now, the reason for that is that we have figured out how to do numerical analysis, but we have not figured out how to teach computers understanding of the world very well. To some extent, we have, of course, nothing is at zero, but the understanding that computers have about the world is pretty bad. To give an example, you know, you take a very young child, maybe a couple of years old, barely able to speak, right? Mm-hmm. You point to something and you say, this is a tree. Tree. It won't take you very long at all. It might take you minutes before that child is able to point to all sorts of objects and say that those are trees, and it'll get them right. To make a computer do that is currently very difficult.
Got it.
Yeah. And what is the difference between a bush and a tree, or a flower and a tree? Very difficult. And then to know certain things, you know, for the toddler or the young child to figure out that the tree needs, for example, water to grow, and soil in which to stand, and so on and so forth. And birds like trees and stuff like that. The child figures that out instantly on its own without needing a teacher. But to teach those kind of logical concepts to computers is a big challenge. So that's where we need a unification, in my opinion, of this numerical machine learning approach and the logical approach that used to be common in artificial intelligence, but was given up because machine learning was so successful.
Got it.
It is successful, but not in communication. And so I think we need to put them together so that these communication systems understand the world.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And all of this, by the way, is the very reason why the Skynet Terminator type AI does not exist yet and will not exist for quite a long time.
I'm not very worried about it. But thank you. Thank you for assuaging the audience concerns, or those that are out there that do have those concerns. Patrick, before we get into some of what you're doing at Samsung with the Brightics Accelerator and so forth, I'd love to just stop by for a couple of minutes. Your work at Algorithmica, you spent 15 years or so working in the oil and gas industries, power generation, things like this. You also are the co-chair of digital energy at the Society for Petroleum Engineers. And you wrote an article recently on what you termed digitization of the energy industry. And here you walk through sort of, I thought it was a very nice set of examples of how well, machine learning, I guess in this case, has, is in all aspects of this value chain, from extraction to everything from trading, oil futures and so forth. Talk just for a couple minutes, if you would, about sort of how machine learning has disrupted this industry. We don't think too much about it. I felt my gas tank, and that's pretty much it. But it's really a very complex, integrated set of businesses there. Walk us through a little bit of how you've seen some successes in that particular industry per your time at Algorithmica.
Yeah, excellent question for that. And I mean, just as a preface, the oil and gas industry is quite important to our civilization, not only because it produces gasoline, but basically all of your chemical products are ultimately based on oil. So plastics, parts for all of your various types of machinery at home, your car, your house, the windows in your house, and so on and so forth, throughout your life. Even the clothes, right? Polyester. What is polyester? It's a chemical product based on petroleum, to some extent. So, it pervades our life. But in order to get all the way to those products, we first, of course, need to find where is there an oil deposit. That is a data analysis question that used to be done by hand and is now largely assisted by computer tools, some of which are AI based. Then we have to drill a big hole down there, which is complicated. You might have to drill a mile or two down, right? So imagine how complicated it is to maybe with your power drill to drill a hole into the wall of your house to mount a shelf or something. Imagine having to drill a hole that's a mile deep through various types of rock, and of course you don't know what are these rocks, right? Because you haven't been there before, right? So it's a discovery process as you drill. So there are failures and breaking of the drill bit or the string that connects the drill bit all the way up to the surface where your motor is to drive the drill. All these aspects are important. Then you've drilled the hole, you've hit the reservoir. Now you have to install a pumping mechanism, basically. It's called completions. You have to basically line the well so that you don't get all the dirt. And then you have to put a pump on top and install all the needs so that it can pump from down below. That's a big engineering effort. And again, AI helps to guide this process to do that completions properly. Then you're in the production stage where you might extract oil from that well for a couple of decades. Some wells only last for a year or two. Some wells last for 30, 40 years. So you might have to maintain that equipment over the long term. So predictive maintenance is a big topic in the oil and gas industry. But also telling, for example, how much of the stuff that comes to the surface is actual oil, right? We're talking about a product of nature that has been made 200 million years ago. So not all of the stuff you're extracting is actual oil. It's mixed up with gas, it's mixed with water that has certain particulate components and bits of rock and sand that come with it. So not only do you then want to measure how much of this stuff is actual oil versus gas versus other stuff, but you also need to separate it out. And then, of course, the oil is a biological product, right? This is decomposed marine creatures of millions of years ago. So you've got these hydrocarbon chains, some of which are very long and some of which are quite short. You need to separate them into their categories, and the very long hydrocarbon chains need to be split up into shorter ones. That's ultimately the job of what's called a refinery, right? And a refinery really is a very sophisticated stove, because what you do basically is you pour some crude oil into a pot and you heat it up. And in the process of heating it up under certain pressure conditions, of course, these long hydrocarbon chains fracture into little pieces, and then you separate them out. And certain sizes of hydrocarbon chains are referred to as gasoline.
Mm-hmm.
Others are kerosene for airplanes. Others are diesel for things like ships and trucks. So these are basically terms for different forms of hydrocarbons. Others are made into what's then called the petrochemical industry, which will result in products like asphalt that you see on your road. Others are yet further refined and processed into the chemicals industry that ends up making, for example, polyester, which makes your clothing, or plastics that are then put, to make the laptop or the TV that you're watching us on right now. So ultimately, that transforms throughout, and we need to optimize these processes to get better conversion rates, to release less CO2 or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And AI helps really throughout this entire process by optimizing every stage, by looking at the efficiencies, by looking at the amount of trash that's being produced, by overcoming things like spilling. So obviously, one of the biggest events in recent memory is Deepwater Horizon,
Sure.
where there was an oil spill that was effectively a global disaster. That's an example of a problem that can be prevented by artificial intelligence under the topic of predictive maintenance, right? You predict in advance when things will fail, and then you shut them down in time. So it can prevent, really damaging events like this from happening.
It's once again going back, it's a fascinating example of how, and we talked about this on some of the other interviews. We don't think of AI and ML in our life as much as that, but here's a major industry, as you're pointing out, trillions of dollars, and AI has taken a part of all of it, and it's exciting that something we think was a very crude industry is so digitized, as you said in your article. Now moving to Samsung, obviously your purview now is much broader than just the oil and gas and power generation industries. Talk a little bit about what the Brightics AI Accelerator is about, what X.insights about, and then I read you think a lot about retail. I come out of sort of the healthcare and pharma industry, and AI is very sexy in terms of drug discovery nowadays in my field. Talk a little bit about sort of, obviously nothing confidential, of course, but sort of the range of industries that you're getting involved with, any interesting projects that you can talk about. Just walk us through all that, if you would.
Yeah. So Samsung is a very interesting company because it basically has the entire manufacturing supply chain in-house as well. Right. So for example, retail is a very interesting use case for us. You might imagine, for example, that you have a free will, right? As an individual human being. And of course, as an individual, you do. But it's very curious that in aggregate, you don't. So if we look at the population of the United States, or even the population of California or a major city like San Francisco, it is very predictable how many people will visit a certain store, online or physical, what they will buy there, in what quantity and what frequency they will buy these things. It's very quantifiable where we have to put the advertising, what the advertising has to say in order to have a certain effect on a certain number of people. And based on things like that, we can then plan how much do we have to produce, where do we have to advertise, what do we have to advertise, what do we have to produce, and then to basically schedule the entire rest of the manufacturing and supply chain based on the prediction of human behavior. Simple other example, of course, is traffic, right? If there's a traffic jam, how long is it? How long will it take to resolve? Very predictable. Yeah. when you're in it, of course, you don't know. But if you can take the big view, maybe the airplane view, it's a completely predictable physical phenomenon. So in aggregate, humans are quite quantifiable and predictable, even though we think we have free will. So AI, a lot of AI, I would say maybe 60 to 70% of all AI that is actually deployed in real life and not some university research project has to do with predicting people's behavior. Because it is really the retail industry and the things that are immediately connected to retail that have bought into AI in a big way. Sure. What's currently in research, of course, the biggest topic that I believe everybody's familiar with is autonomous driving. We are trying, as a global research community, to teach cars to drive themselves. There's tremendous progress, but as everybody knows, that tremendous progress has not really hit the store. You cannot buy currently an autonomous vehicle. You can buy vehicles that get a little closer to it. There are these assistance systems that, for example, keep you in your lane and things like that, that you can buy. And then there are a few cars available that kind of drive themselves under certain conditions. That's certainly a huge research direction that's being taken by many companies and many universities. At Samsung, we do a lot of computer vision, which is the analysis of images. And there we see a really good connection to healthcare, because healthcare produces a lot of interesting images, MRI scan, CT scan, photographs, X-rays, ultrasound, all sorts of technologies produce medical images or medical videos. That can then be analyzed to find out, is there a disease at all? Or are you healthy? And if there is a disease, what is it? Where is it? How big is it? And of course, AI can do that instantly. It can do it with very high accuracy. And so it can really help doctors to figure out, what to look at more critically. And to give them a kind of baseline to check. Nobody wants to substitute the doctor, sure. Right? There will never be, or at least not within my lifetime, an AI doctor, but there will be an AI assistant, sure, to the doctor. And that is realistic, and that's something that everybody, including us at Samsung, is working on.
And in continuing along that path, you spend a lot of time sort of thinking of the future, thinking of what's coming with the artificial intelligence. But another very important topic, which we touched on some previous shows, is this principle of the Internet of Things. And we've gotten a little into this theme of how over time we've seen this movement from internet to the cloud, and now to this concept of edge computing and having all these really intelligent things in our house around here that are capable of doing stuff for us. Could you talk a little bit about some of the areas that you are passionate about in terms of the Internet of Things? Once again, I think a lot of obviously about the smart home, but we talk a lot about smart healthcare on the show, about how if we can just be healthy here and access telemedicine and other things of that nature, we don't have to go to the hospital, we don't have to go to that appointment. Talk a little bit about some of what you're doing on Internet of Things front.
Yeah, no, that's great. Of course, the first thing for Internet of Things to your private life is you need to instrument your environment. All right, so of course, Samsung also makes some of the sensor equipment that you might need to do that. Yep. And some of the actuators that follow. So for instance, right, you might want a smart home to draw the blinds when it gets dark. Okay. So you need to have a sensor that will see if is it light or dark, and then you need an actuator that actually pulls down the blinds or pulls up the blinds, right? So there is a certain amount of mechanical and sensor technology that you need to have in your home to allow you to do that. And then, of course, you can install the kind of computer technology that carries it out. It can do very simple things, like if it gets dark, you pull the blinds down. That's not really artificial intelligence yet. But many people nowadays have a Nest system, for example, to guide their heating and cooling in their house. And that is a small amount of machine learning right there, in that it tries to figure out what is your favorite temperature profile over the course of the day, or the weekday versus the weekend, and so on. And it will then learn from how you set the temperature, and then sets it automatically for you. We can debate whether or not it does that well and accurately, but there are first steps in that direction, right? How is your home supposed to behave? I think we all heard, 10, 15 years ago about the fridge that can order milk automatically because you've run out.
Sure.
That has turned out not to quite hit the market. And the reason for things like this, of course, not working is that it requires very, very heavy cooperation with people, right? So if you want the fridge to detect that you've run out of milk, you better put the milk in the same location in the fridge every single time, right? Because if you put your apple juice in place of the fridge, your orders are going to get messed up, and that's the problem. You need to have the right kind of interface between the human users who want to live their life and their smart home. Then, of course, you have other problems. For example, if there's a power cut, your smart home doesn't work anymore. And there's the case of the elderly couple that was locked inside their own home and had issues after a day or two in a power cut. So you need to watch out for some of these aspects of real life. Now, with telemedicine, of course, this is hugely interesting. You can instrument yourself very easily, for example, by a smartwatch. Again, Samsung makes these guys, and as well as many other companies. They will, for example, measure your pulse. They measure the number of steps you walk, and on the basis of some very simple things like this, they're able to gauge your level of fitness, and they can encourage you to walk a little more. With a few other sensors that you can have that will measure your blood pressure, for example, or your blood sugar levels, you can very nicely monitor yourself and some conditions. So for example, for diabetics, there is a sensor that they can wear 24 hours a day that will measure their blood sugar. And at the back of that, there is a service that, if they're ever in trouble, the service will automatically, based on blood sugar measurements and pulse measurements and so on, realize that here's a person in trouble and send help, call 911 on their behalf. Extremely useful, life-saving service that is based on very simple measurements that you can have on your body 24/7. You can think of making this more and more elaborate, where, of course, if you have certain conditions, you can regularly get, for example, an imaging study done. And the doctor who advises you does not need to be present, right? Because these pictures can be sent by systems somewhere else. So you might imagine completely detaching the process of creating the data from the process of interpreting the data, which at the moment is done by the same people, right? You go to the same doctor's office to have your picture taken, as well as get your interpretation result. So things like this could become a lot easier for the patient, for us. We no longer maybe need to make an appointment a month in advance to see our doctor, but rather, okay, just go in the clinic, have the scan done, and then have it interpreted some other time. So definitely I see healthcare as being probably the #1 industry now in the near future, in the next 5 to 10 years, that will heavily benefit from AI. And I think we will see a fundamental shift on how healthcare works. especially in the direction of more actual care of health rather than care of sick, right? So nowadays we really find ourselves more in a sick care environment rather than a healthcare environment. Because what it really is that people get ill, they go in, and the system sends them home with medication. That's not really how it's supposed to be, right? We're supposed to get healthcare in the sense that we never even get sick because we took care of ourselves while we were healthy. And I think it's that huge transition that really needs AI, because it means you can keep track of your state of health without too much effort and can get automated suggestions on how to keep you there.
Outstanding. Absolutely. Patrick, one of the things I've heard you speak to in the past when you get into sort of the discussions of principles surrounding the deployment of these different tools and things like ethics and bias and so forth. And one of the things that you talked about recently was sort of the need for not just sort of the technical people, but for the output, for people really have an understanding of why decisions are made within these systems. And you pointed to an example. Look, if I got a business plan, I'm going into my local bank and the bank rejects me because it's a horrible business, fine. But when the neural network, AI, machine learning rejects it because of line 328 in the code, but so forth and so on, there's a difference there between, in my understanding. Talk a little bit about sort of the importance of sort of this area of understanding the decisions that are coming out of these tools.
Yeah, this is called explainability.
Yeah.
So if you Google it under explainability, you'll find a lot of research on this topic. And basically the idea is that machine learning models are so complex that they effectively are a black box. To stay with your loan application example, you stick the application documents into the AI and you get out a rejected or accepted decision. Now, back in the old days, when you went into the bank manager kind of talked to you. So at the end of the conversation, you knew why you were being accepted or rejected. The AI systems, as such, don't do that. And now, especially in that loan example, it's now a legal requirement by the government to output an explanation of some kind. And I think this will become more and more prevalent as we go forward, especially in healthcare again, because people, not only the patients, but also the government regulators will want the AI systems to be able to explain their result in some understandable fashion. And so AI explainability is an important area, which currently is still largely a research area. So you will find very few systems, other than the loan example for banks, because it already is a legal requirement, that will output an explanation. Very few. And for many types of artificial intelligence model, it's still being researched at universities how to get an explanation out of them. It's definitely a challenging, new and up and coming area in AI that I think will be really crucial.
Excellent. Patrick, one wrap-up question here. We're getting a little off topic, but I'd love to give you a couple minutes on this one. I read, back when you were, I think, 12 years old, you started practicing martial arts. You started practicing Buddhist meditation at the time. And I had, about a year ago now, Dupton Jinpa, who was the Dalai Lama's main translator at the time. He runs an organization called the Compassion Institute now. And one of the things he was talking about, the Dalai Lama's, visions on artificial intelligence and so forth, was, this stuff's all great, but AI needs to have compassion as well. Talk just for a few minutes about your own practice. And I saw you also, I think you taught a course actually at one point called Deduction and Reality, Bridging Science, Religion, and Metaphysics. Just walk us through a couple minutes on this, if you would, because I think it's another fascinating area that of your bio.
Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, I follow Tibetan Buddhism. I meditate on a daily basis ever since I was about 12 years old. Um, and yeah, I got more seriously into it as an adult, where I studied it. I studied with various people, ended up getting a couple of degrees on the topic. So I find it very fascinating. Um, it definitely helps, and helps me, not only in private life but also in business life to have certain skill sets. So one of the things is concentration, right? Meditation is something that benefits your concentration. So there are all sorts of real benefits. So I can only recommend it to everybody as a great practice. Compassion is, of course, one of the big concepts in Tibetan Buddhism, because you don't just want to get spiritual benefit or mental benefit for yourself. This whole thing is regarded to be useful only in the context of you then wanting to help other people. Not to be misunderstood in an evangelical kind of sense, right? Nobody wants to, I mean, at least on the Buddhist side, wants to persuade other people to follow this path. But compassion in the sense of, I wish for your well-being kind of a thing. And AI, of course, doesn't have that, right? AI, for the most part, as I said, the systems that are actually deployed are machine learning systems, not even AI systems as such. And in such a way, they only really calculate things, right? Based on numbers that they have seen in the past, they will calculate numbers for the future. They don't have an understanding of the world. They don't have an understanding of causality. They don't have an understanding of morality or ethics. They don't have an understanding of the consequences that happen in real life due to some of the decisions that these AI ML systems influence. To stick with an extremely simple example, again, that loan example, right? If I reject somebody's loan, that has an effect on that person's life and other people that are connected to that person, right? Their family and kids and parents and whatnot. That's going to make them feel bad and going to have a certain, ramifications. Now, a bank manager might be able to show compassion and take it into account that this person really needs it. That could lead to a different outcome, and it may or may not be good for the business. I'm not, going into that, but if you have the conversation with a person, at least there is a role for compassion to enter the game somehow. And with AI, it doesn't. And in order to provide AI with compassion, it first needs to have knowledge about the world and knowledge about the consequences of its own outputs. So I think it would be great if AI did have that kind of feeling, but in order to get there, I think we still need to fulfill a few prerequisites. So I don't think that this will be, at all soon. That we will have compassionate AI systems available, but I think it's the right goal and it's an important goal. Now, in that context, His Holiness the Dalai Lama puts on a conference called the Mind and Life Conference, which you see it goes back quite a few years, and there are proceedings published every year, and these topics come up at that conference. So, if the audience is interested in these topics, I encourage them to look up Mind and Life Conference and see some of the discussions that are going on between meditators and scientists. Scientists from the physical sciences as well as the mathematical AI sciences.
Yeah, that's a fascinating intersection, and that's why I wanted to have you talk for a couple minutes on it, because I think sometimes we get separated a little too much of the human component of all this technology, and you have a very interesting convergent knowledge base here. So that's why I appreciate you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for asking. It is good to keep the context in mind. You know, AI people typically focus only on accuracy, right? I want to reproduce the training data I have with the highest possible accuracy, so that I can generalize also to my test cases, right? But what's the bigger picture, right? What damage am I causing with a false positive?
Yep.
And that then enters AI ethics, right? Yep. So, for instance, if I may, there was a recent case where the British government applied AI methods to grade A-level graduates. These are, you know, A-levels is the high school equivalent, right, in Britain. Yep. So if the AI gives good students good grades, no problem. If it gives bad students good grades, kind of like, okay, not quite right, but not too horrible. But if it gives bad grades to good students, it kind of ruins their life, because then they don't get to go to university, or they don't get to do the degree they want to, then their career is impacted, and so on and so forth. So the damage of the worst case false positive is extremely high in that example. For me, that means you must not do this, right? This is an ethical dilemma. So therefore, AI could be used to do this, but it shouldn't. Right. And in this case, of course, the British population agreed, they demonstrated, and the government eventually revoked this. But that's an example where the compassion was missing in the system, and therefore created a bad result.
Fascinating, really fascinating times. Well, Patrick, it's been fascinating listening to you and hearing about your visions, and wishing you the best with all of this moving forward. I see why they have you in this position as visionary of the future. So cheers to Samsung for that. For everybody that's going to be listening to this episode on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Patrick Bangert, Vice President of Artificial Intelligence, Head of the Artificial Intelligence Engineering and Sciences teams at Samsung SDS, subsidiary of the Samsung Group, responsibility for the Brightics AI Accelerator and the X.insights program. Check out his books, Optimization for Industrial Problems, Machine Learning, Data Science in the Oil and Gas Industry. Patrick, it's been a great time talking to you. Once again, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show and do this. I want to thank you for everything you do at Samsung, for advancing these technologies. And as we say on the show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow via what you're doing. It's very inspiring work, and just thanking you again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure.